tonight. And this is the Horror Writers Association, Colorado chapters, Yog-Sothoth Award Band. And the award is for recognition of Colorado writers and a chance to meet the writer and to ask questions and hear a reading. So usually my alter ego, Edward Bryant, does the interview, but I'm going to stand in tonight and do my best. So I'd like to introduce Carter Wilson, our Yog-Sothoth winner for the month of August.
Very happy to be here. Thank you. I'm sorry Ed's not here. We're a little bit worried about that, but hopefully he'll show up at some point.
Well, Ed has talked a lot about the difference business-wise in how you marketed your two books. And one of the reasons he thought it was important to have you talk to the local writers was it was his perception that you spent a huge amount of effort marketing the first one that you didn't on the second one. And so could you talk about how you went about marketing your first book?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, I'll preface it by saying that, you know, aside from writing, I have a full-time job that pays the bills. So having a huge amount of time to do anything is strained for me. And so when my first book was published, it was a very, very small, new imprint. And, you know, my impression was this might be the only chance I ever have to have something published at all. So I wanted to put as much effort behind the marketing of it as I could, so I could at least say, look, no matter what happens, I did everything I could to get myself known, to get this book out there. So if it doesn't go anywhere, it's not through my own lack of effort. I belong to the International Thriller Writers Association, so I usually go to their annual conference in New York, and so through that I made a lot of contacts, one of whom is MJ Rose, who has her own author marketing agency. And so that was where really a lot of my effort went, was to Goodreads campaigns, book buzzes, you know, and just not so much that I was hitting the sidewalk and trying to get the book sold, as opposed to just, you know, spending money, my own money, on marketing that I had learned was at least a fairly effective route, or at least as effective as any marketing is, because I mean there was certainly almost zero, you know, support from the publisher, which I've since learned kind of is fairly true for authors at my level, whether you're, you know, with Random House or you're with a tiny little publisher, that a lot of it's on you. And you know, I did some things like, you know, book signings and events like this, and those are great, but in terms of, you know, really getting books sold because of that, I don't think that translates very well. So social media was a big thrust for me, really trying to you know, target on, especially on Facebook, groups that I thought kind of might be interested, and just being active and trying to be relevant and trying to, you know, advertise myself. That, you know, even though a lot of times that feels gratuitous, but that's all you read about, is how you just have to be constantly out there. I know one woman who, she spent 7 months on the road with her whole family, just, you know, I forget, had 12,000 miles, I think, zigzagging across the United States back and forth, hitting bookstores all in her own time. I don't know how that translated into sales for her. I mean, she'd go into signings, and, you know, there, you know, 3 people would show up, and, you know, go to the next place. So it's, maybe I'm rambling too much, but it's a brutal industry, is what I've been learning. So
Of the book buzz and Goodreads, so you were trying to generate a sort of a critical mass in people taking a chance on first book, and then hopefully reviewing it, recommending it to their friends.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and I think I think without doing that, I'll give you a good example. So on Final Crossing, I did some Goodreads, like actual ads on Goodreads, and you look at your stats, and maybe it says like 300 people have added that book to read, and maybe 30 to 40 reviews. So not big numbers, but I think if I hadn't done anything, I can't imagine that there would be any interest there at all. So we would do giveaways to book clubs. We would do mailings that would go out to groups of 50 to 70,000 people, and the percent hits that you get on that is very low, but I don't know how else you get your name out there, except for some kind of word of mouth grassroots campaign. But it's such a competitive industry. I think unless you're willing and able to spend either a tremendous amount of time, but more importantly a decent amount of money, I'm not really sure how you get established today.
Well, with the second book, did you take the things that you found most effective, harvest those and bring those?
I'd like to say yes, but no. With the second book, to me, it was a larger publisher, still a small publisher, but a larger publisher, more established, and so they were at least able to send out some ARCs, get some advanced. I had more access to high-level reviews than I did with the first publisher, so I think that alone was helpful. But in my mind, I just felt like I couldn't really afford to spend the amount of money that I spent on the first book. So I spent probably about half as much on this one, but I contacted MJ and kind of said, here's my budget, what is going to be the most effective. And actually what was actually great to do was a book club about Final Crossing in conjunction with kind of some other marketing that we did with Boy in the Woods. And and the whole Amazon thing is very fascinating to me, but I've made more money, or I should say I've made actual money in terms of over cost, doing a book club by reducing Final Crossing's ebook price. I think it was $1.99 on Amazon. For a week, we sold like 1,000 copies. Maybe it was 99 cents, I forget. But I mean, that astounded me. Like, well, there's the appetite for cheap books. I mean, and I think Amazon's kind of created that whole monster. Whether you agree with it or disagree with it, I think they've guided the consumer to only wanting to pay a certain amount of money. I mean, and I don't think there's any way around it now. And I saw that. I mean, I was excited. Like, geez, 1,000 copies that I sold in a week. That's for some book that nobody knows about. That was amazing. But trying to sell The Boy in the Woods, and I think the publisher has the ebook now is like a $10.99, but it wasn't $14.99. That's a tough sell. So I think you still have these publishers that are fighting against that model, and I'm not saying that the Amazon model is right, but I think that's the reality of the marketplace, is that people just $2.99, $3.99, that's what they want, and it's kind of depressing.
Well, there does seem to be an emerging school of thought that if the price is much less, then something has to give. So there's less of a story, or it's more of a pulp story.
Right.
Gary Jones talked at length about writing Bigfoot porno novels.
Right.
But he would only, I believe he said he would only spend 7 hours on them, period, with no rewrite.
Yeah.
And then he felt that justified a lower price.
Sure.
What's your thinking on how much you can afford to give a reader?
Yeah. Well, I think that boils down to why you're writing in the first place. Are you writing because that's your business and that's how you make your living? And are you able to kind of marry that with, really enjoying it and putting out the quality of level of work that makes you proud? I couldn't do that. I don't, that would be difficult for me to write something quickly, and I'm not established enough where I would even see that there's a market for that. I don't even write short stories. I focus primarily on writing novels. And yeah, I'm fortunate enough to have a job, like I said earlier, that pays the bills. But I think if you're a writer who's sustaining yourself on writing, you do have to look at it as a commodity. So I think from a business perspective, and if you've got the talent to be able to spend 7 hours on something that is sellable, why wouldn't you do that? It is what you're producing. So I mean, if it works, I think that's great. And obviously somebody's got to be out there to be willing to pay for it. And if it is, you should do that.
Are you tempted by the electronic market?
Again, I was surprised by the reaction to the Final Crossing sales on eVersion. I'm not hugely attracted to it. I mean, I think it exists for a very good reason. I think ebooks are very important, but and maybe it's an ego thing, but there's still something about publishing in print in addition to ebook that I think it certainly is important to me. So, but I know several authors who are, hey, ebook is the way to go because they're able to churn out a book very quickly. I mean, that's the other thing for me. It takes me a year to write a book, at least. And I'm not the fastest writer, but to me, it's just carving out the time of the day to do that. So it's, that becomes a very difficult perspective to say, I spent a year doing this. Am I going to be happy going with an e-publisher that's going to sell it for $1.99 and that's where it'll forever live? So, and then boy, do you have something after that ready to go? Well, no, because it takes me a year to write a book. So it's, it's a little bit of a vortex you kind of get sucked down into, unfortunately, at least at my level. I mean, my goal would obviously be I would love to be able to write full time and sustain myself writing, and I'm slowly, I think, working my way towards that, but it's probably several years away.
Well, do you ever think about some of the well-known writers like H.P. Lovecraft essentially worked in obscurity and died in obscurity and then was discovered?
Sounds great.
So you must consider, though, the possibility that the writing has true power and true staying ability, but it is not being recognized as such.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no question. I mean, why would you do it otherwise? I mean, I think if you're able to sustain yourself writing, that is the result that just happens as opposed to what you're trying to accomplish. I don't write because I'm trying to sustain myself writing. I write because I enjoy it, and I write because it's a part of my life that I can explore, and and if I'm able to get somewhere with it, that's fantastic. But I absolutely recognize the high likelihood of never being able to sustain myself writing. I mean, because the people who do, it's a fraction. When you really look at the numbers, and I work in a business world, so when I started learning about the publishing industry, I was fascinated by it because it's a fairly horrendous industry, especially for fiction. And just looking at the numbers and looking at the trends and seeing what's happening, I don't know why you would ever. And I've known people who they'll write 50 pages of something for the first time, and then, well, I'm a writer now. I'm going to quit my day job. And why would you ever do that? Like, truly the people who I know who sustain them or who don't have a full-time job and are writing full-time are usually, married with a spouse who's the primary breadwinner. So, I think that it's a very hard industry to really look at and say, I'm all in. This is how I'm going to pay the bills, and I'm always impressed by people who do that, but it's not very many that I know.
In looking at the trends and doing market research, how much does that guide what you write?
Very little. I think a lot of what changes in my writing is feedback I get from people in my critique group. But that being said, I do get, I'll write something and I always give the first 100 pages to my agent to say, what do you think? And she'll definitely give me feedback about, things that she likes and doesn't like, but also like, this has been done before, or, you got to be careful about this because serial killers, everyone does serial killers. So she will give me very market-based feedback. And I've suffered a lot in my writing because what interests me when I write is I really like everyday person in an extraordinary situation. And the extraordinary situation is usually something that's very bad. And I like to see how that person reacts to it. And what's happened in the past is I like the idea that the person fails a lot, because I think that's the reality of what would happen, and maybe hopefully finally overcoming all odds at the end. But I think writing-wise, what that makes for is a fairly weak protagonist, because this person's always failing and maybe they're kind of unlikable. To me, it's just interesting, and after 4 books with my agent getting universally rejected by houses, she would send them to maybe 15 to 18 different houses, year after year after year. Finally said, well, what I'm going to do for my next book is I really want to focus on the villain because that interests me. And I'm going to have a good protagonist, but it's going to be, somebody who's strong, ex-military. It's going to be somebody I like. I don't want it to be a complete sellout, but in a way, kind of, I'm not focusing on the protagonist, I'm focusing on the villain. And that was the book that finally sold, Final Crossing. And I like the protagonist, but to me it wasn't a focus. But it's funny to hear readers who say, oh, I love this guy, there's going to be another book with this guy, and you start to realize, like, wow, that is, kind of what the market wants, at least for mass market fiction. But I don't think it influences what I decide to write. I think sometimes it influences when I go back and review something, like if I dive too deep into a psychological element or something like that, I might remove things to keep the pacing tight and fast. But that's probably the extent of it.
Changing gears a little bit, you touched on Mary, the agent that you work with. What is that relationship like? You described her as a
Pam.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Apologize.
She's fantastic. I was very fortunate to get on her client list with my first book, which obviously never sold. And that was 11 years ago. And it amazes me how hard these agents work. And she's a single shop agent, and she represented Steve Berry for quite some time. And so she has about 30 clients or so. But that they work. I mean, it's not like she's spending 40 hours a week on me by any means. Our interactions are pretty limited, but that she sticks with you year after year after year, and then, nothing sells, and then finally something sells, and it's not a lot of money. So, her return, so she's investing in you, just saying, I'm assuming at some point you're going to be worthwhile to me. And I've always told her, like, please don't ever leave me because I don't know what I would do. But she's been fantastic, and we're just going through, actually this week, trying to, we have an offer for a 3rd book that just came in this week, so there's been a lot of communication, trying to get a hold of the other publishers that it's still out with, and I look at the emails that she sends to these people, and she's very flattering of me, and I can't say good enough things about her.
In contrast to that, you were somewhat disillusioned with the relationship with the publisher per se.
Yeah, I don't know if I had huge expectations with the publisher because I'd been pretty forewarned. But I mean, and I really don't have anything bad to say about either publisher. I mean, the first publisher was a brand new small house that has come and gone. I mean, it went out of business. Fortunately, after Final Crossing, kind of had some time on the market, but it almost happened before it was released, which was nearly heartbreaking. So I had very low expectations in terms of anything that they were going to be able to funnel towards me. I mean, whatever support they could give me, they did, and they were good about it. And you know, the second house was particularly interesting. Severn House, who's based in the UK, larger house. You know, heavy focus on libraries, decent distribution, particularly in the UK. You know, they were great to work with, but it's, you know, again, not a lot of PR support, not a lot of marketing support, except for, you know, some mentions in Publishers Weekly. But they are, man, all about the numbers, and it's very interesting. I went through a very interesting learning lesson with these guys, because what they essentially said is, you know, we need you to sell. We're going to do a print run of 1,600 hardback, and you know, we need you to sell 1,300 to make you break even. And they had the right of first refusal on my third book, and you know, we keep in touch with them, and the editor says, we want to go with a third book, but we need to see the sales on this one first. And I think the sales last week clocked in were like 1150, and they're like, sorry, that's, you know, and I forget what the ebook sales, I forget what they're at. They're not bad, but I mean, these aren't big numbers. But you know, because you didn't sell another 150 copies, you know, you see the email thread. It's really interesting. Edwin, who's the head of the company, says, yeah, we love your book, we want to go with it, but you know, this is the reality of publishing. And it's like, wow, that's crazy. You know, so I guess at my level, what I'm experiencing is that I haven't seen a house that has really invested into a future that says, you know, yeah, maybe this was lower than expectations, but we're building an audience, we're marketing you, you know, because, you know, if we can do this properly, we'll get there, and future returns will supplant all, you know, current losses. It's just, well, we tried, you know, you were 100 copies shy, so what can we do? And that was disillusioning. That kind of surprised me. So, you know, and I talked to Pam. I'm like, what more can I do? She's like, nothing. You've done everything you can do, and you just kind of hope to shop it to a new one. And then you start to get a little worried about, okay, well, then you look at a third house, and they're going to say, well, what were the sales on these two, and why were we with two different publishers? But that's kind of the reality of it now. So so we have an offer on the table from another house, a fairly well established house, small, for a third book. So I'm like, okay, let's just, you know, at least maybe have another book out, so just keep the train rolling. You know, if you can still kind of get a book out a year, maybe these guys will stick with me. But you know, they're going to have, I would think that they would have the same kind of attitude of like, well, we've got to sell a certain number of copies. But, you know, that's the reality of being a very small, you know, a small selling author in today's day. And so you do start to think, well, why don't I just, you know, self-publish on Amazon? And if I could sell 1,000 copies and I'm getting, you know, most of that royalty, why wouldn't I do that? But that's just that's not something that interests me at this point. You know, I still want to kind of be with a house that can help promote me.
Do you anticipate a problem with Severin releasing the rights to the third book, which they do?
The option expired on it.
Oh.
Yeah, they've officially passed on it. We went back to them and said, look, we have an offer. We're just checking in. They're like, yeah, we can. And all the while, the editor says, we love working with Carter, and we really like this next book. And I think that's what's frustrating. I'd almost rather hear like, yeah, this isn't a book that we're interested in, rather than have it be so. I mean, I get it. I get the numbers. I mean, you know, I'm in business. It makes sense, but it seems a little bit myopic to me that, you know, surely there must be other examples where you invest in a newer author And I kind of brought this up with them, and they kind of said, well, we don't usually take new authors. We're an exception, which is nice, but, you know, so I don't think they knew what to expect.
Well, the cover art is truly good.
Oh, I was very happy with it, and I had no input on it whatsoever. They, at least with the first book, we had options. They just said, "Here's the cover art," and I'm like, "Oh, thank God, it looks awesome." The only input we had was her hair was blonde, and I'm like, "Well, she's a redhead, the villain," so they changed that. But yeah, it's a nice looking book, although. You know, I will say I do think, you know, and this is just my personal opinion, and I feel like it's priced very high for the package. I mean, it's a fairly small book, and it's $28.95. You know, like I mentioned, the ebook was $15.99 for quite some time, and yeah, I've gotten comments on Facebook. I'd love to buy this. It's too expensive. I've gotten. You know, this woman came to me from Goodreads and said, "Look, I am the moderator of a 2,600 member global thriller reading club, and I'm interested in your book, but there's no way, if I go to my members and recommend it, I'm going to get slaughtered because it's too expensive." And so I actually put her in touch with my publisher saying, like, "Look, can you do something?" And they actually worked with her, but then I think they discounted like $1. You know, so she's reading it, but I don't know if she's going to make a recommendation. So I think, you know, these are the things that you have to kind of fight against. And I'm not on the business side of it, so, you know, maybe it makes perfect sense not to discount it more. But I personally feel like that is one of the things that's hurt me, is that it was, you know, I think it was fairly expensive in that there wasn't a paperback version, but the ebook was a little pricey as well.
We're selling it for 26.
I hope you get it.
Well, there must be an emotional strain there to be told you need to sell another 100 copies and have someone say, "I would like to buy 2,600 copies," and the publisher to be unable to somehow make these two things work.
Right, absolutely. No, there absolutely is, and that's. You know, and I don't say much because I don't feel like, in a way I feel it's weird. I feel like it's really not my place. I do everything through Pam, and they do what they can. But those are the moments where you're feeling like, well, geez, why am I not just doing this myself and being entrepreneurial about it? But then I start to think, well, if I did it myself, would this woman have even ever noticed it to even get me to the position to sell 2,600 copies? And that's what I'm kind of unclear about is, you know, you do hear these stories about people who've done very well on their own, but I think it's much fewer than you hear about or than you're led to believe. So, I don't know. I mean, the company who just put an offer on my third book, you know, like I said, they're smaller, but they would send out 200 advanced review copies, which would be phenomenal. I've never had that kind of exposure before. So, I mean, to me, like, okay, that's at least an ability to get more reviews. But that's what you end up doing. You look at somebody else who sold with that publisher, how many reviews did they get? You know, what kind of, you know, oh, this is out in audiobook also. Okay, so at this point in my career, it's more important to me for just getting exposure rather than any kind of money, because the money's terrible. I mean, I lose money on every book because I spend more on my own personal marketing than I'm ever getting from the book. But at this point, it's just about staying relevant, staying out there, just hoping to build an audience, so that somewhere down the road, something might hit. But without kind of sustaining that along the way, I'm not sure how you do that. I mean, you very rarely hear stories about somebody who just hits out of the blue and didn't do much to contribute to that. I mean, it happens, but almost never.
So, with this book, they didn't send out 100 or?
No, they sent out. To be honest, I don't actually know how many they sent out because it kind of happens, you know, without my involvement. You know, it had more access to reviews, like Booklist, for example. But we did a promotion where people could ask, bloggers could request, you know, e-versions to review, but there weren't very many on that. So yeah, I mean, again, if it was something that physically cost, I mean, I don't know if they actually printed any advanced review copies to send out. I never saw any of them. I don't think that they did. I mean, it's just, these publishers just spend no money on it at that level, and so it's kind of it's a cycle where you're like, well, how are we going to make money if we're not, investing a little bit into it? But, again, it's a fairly new industry to me in terms of the business side of things, so, you have to kind of just like, well, this is your industry, and this is, you're the publisher, so I assume you know what you're doing. But, and that's not to say that, you could also not sell books because your book sucks. I mean, that's not to say it's just a bad industry. You have to have a good book and a compelling story as well, which I think I do, but, I don't want to blame it all on the publishers because you never know.
Well, I think it's a testament that you published your first two books in the current economy and what's happening with successful mid-list writers being handed back their inventory,
Right.
and wished well. So it would seem as though there's almost no one in the industry who isn't struggling. I don't know if struggling is the right word, of having to work real hard to build on success. At HWA National Congress, they had a very large spread of just cover artists, and it was interesting that many well-known writers were buying their own covers and insisting their own covers went on the books. Caitlin McKernan, while I was there, spent $5,000 for a cover, and it was kind of educational from my viewpoint of always thinking, well, the publisher supplies the cover art and you don't have say on it.
Right.
But what seemed to be emerging in what many of the horror writers were talking about is they were no longer willing to be victims of covers, and it was worth it to them to buy the cover.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's something you can certainly put in the contract, is to at least have to be consulted on it. But, current contracts don't typically have that in there, so you have to go and fight for that. And that's the other thing too, is, I've got Pam who's, calling me and saying, I want to insert all this language in this contract, but I don't know if I'm going to get anything. And, you look at this contract and, you kind of let her do what she thinks is best, but you're kind of in a tight position, like how much, you can hopefully get some more advance or a few small kind of things, but not usually so much about royalties or, one interesting thing is, they want the right of first refusal on the next book. They not even the right of first refusal, they want to have the ability for my next book, unnamed, to have the same contract terms apply. And, that's something that I'm sensitive about, because, again, you're spending a year working on this, and I feel like kind of what I'm working on now, I'm very happy with it so far, and you want to think that there's real potential for it. So, those are the kind of things that I struggle with in some of the contract language I'm seeing today. And thematic rights as well. They want to be able to obtain thematic rights and go to their own production company. And, that's another thing where you feel like, well, but there might be much more potential for it. I go somewhere else. And you just kind of struggle with, well, what do I do? Otherwise they don't buy my book and I start the process all over again.
So
I'm complaining a lot. Sorry. It's very germane this week because we're going through this, and I'm very happy about the offer that I have. So I'm not complaining, but it's very much on my mind, the business side of it this week.
Well, the interview is like interviewing a seasoned middleweight fighter. looking toward a title shot.
Yeah.
On the contract that they'll be offering you, since you've already signed 2 contracts, and the frustration that you've shared tonight, I think to everyone seems very valid, because I think everyone in this room would like to pound on the table if they were in that circumstances and say, you know, why don't you go to send someone to conventions and sell another 100 copies? Why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? But you've been able to hold back from that. And the 3rd book, what changes do you foresee from, as the artist, trying to demand?
You know, that's a great question. I don't know. You know, first of all, it wouldn't come out till August 2015, so, which I like, because it gives you time to save up money to spend on it. I wouldn't go back to spending the amount of money I certainly spent on the first book. I'd probably spend the amount of money I spent on the second book in terms of marketing. I've built up more kind of a social media network since this has come out. So I would continue to kind of go after it on that side of things. But I'm not, you know, I guess I don't have any expectations that the process of production and sales from the publisher side, with the exception of the ARCs, would be a lot different than what I've expected. You know, I've heard very good things about this house. They're very small, but I've heard that they spend money. You know, they host kind of high-level cocktail receptions at big conferences and things like that for you know, basically a retired husband and wife publisher. They put out 12 titles a year, so it sounds like they're small, but they put a lot of focus on their authors. So, but I don't know how that translates into actual differences and expectations of, okay, well, you know, they're going to, you know, put out ads, or they're going to, you know, make sure I go on blog tours or something like that. I don't really have any different expectations.
And changing from talking about business, which is fascinating, I think, to everyone here. Almost everyone in this room would be very happy to have sold 1,000 copies of anything.
I bought 800 of those, by the way.
When you think about the art and the art that you want to achieve, it sounds like that your art is evolving. You were thinking maybe somewhat related to marketing trends. Where do you see your art moving from Boy in the Woods next? Do you see it continuing to move toward more mainstream thriller?
I do, actually. You know, and the book that has a contract right now is, you know, I think it was mentioned to you earlier, I think The Boy in the Woods is the darkest thing I've ever written, in terms of subject matter, not necessarily in terms of, you know, graphic scenes, but the next book is written from a woman's point of view, which is the first time I've ever done that, and it's definitely more thriller than horror. I mean, there's some very edgy scenes in it for sure. But then what I'm working on now is actually a rewrite of the second book I'd ever written, which is one of the 4 books that were rejected, and the only one that I just go back and think about and think, you know, it's a good story, but I didn't write it well enough. And so it's the only book that I've ever gone back to, and I've, you know, tried to rewrite, and, you know, I'm kind of in the midst of that right now, and that is very almost purely psychological thriller, and, you know, it definitely has some dark elements to it, but it is, you know, it's not disturbing necessarily. So I guess in that maybe it's a little bit more commercial, and it's actually interesting. I shared with some of these guys, as we got this contract, and then this week Pam started going back to some of the larger houses that it was still out with, we got an email, I think it was Random House, and I shared it with a couple of these guys here. It was a very flattering email. It was a very flattering rejection, saying, I'm not going to buy this, but I hear all the things I love about it. And he just basically said, oh, it's Mulholland. And they said, the problem is, it's a bit too dark for us. And he called it a bit too nasty. And his concern was about, and honestly, I think it's one of the least nasty things that I've written. His concern was, this is our readership, and I'm afraid it's a bit too edgy for our readership. So those are the kind of things where you're like, that's kind of interesting. And then you look at some of the things maybe they publish, you're like, well, that's just as dark. But just to quickly answer your question, I don't think I'm reacting to marketplace. I think it just happens that I'm moving away from some of the darker stuff. I don't know if it's out of my system or if it's just, the stories that I'm writing now just happen to be the ones that interest me at the moment, and they're not quite have the same kind of horrific elements to them.
So your artistic vision is separate in the end, despite all the forces arrayed against you. It's independent, because you've described different business forces around you criticizing and trying to drive your work in directions, and having to stay true to what you want to write.
Well, I think you also have to recognize when you get a rejection, because I'll get a lot of rejections that aren't saying, well, we love it, but it's just not the right book for us, for our market. I mean, I get some of those, but I also get ones that say, you know what, your main character is just totally unappealing to me, and so that drives me more, and just like, okay, well, maybe they're right, maybe this person is too weak, and I have changed characters, not because I thought it would necessarily sell a book more, but you have to look at it and say, well, maybe there's truth to this, and maybe my character is uninteresting, and maybe I'm so close to this character that I find them interesting, but when you step back and you're looking at just people who are spending 3 hours reading your book, that's a wholly different reaction. So, you are writing to entertain at the end of the day, and I'm not so sold on my own vision of things that, hey, what I've written is perfect by any means. I want people to be engaged by my stories more than I'm a slave to the art itself. So I will change if I think it's going to make it a better book and make it more acceptable in a way of like people just enjoy it, but not necessarily. I won't start with I'm going to write this type of book is now it's hot, so I'm going to write a book just like this and hope it sells. Maybe I should. I've never tried that.
Well, there's some interesting historical examples, like Itogawa Rampo, which was the Japanese writer, and that's how a Japanese man pronounces Edgar Allan Poe. He took the name sort of as a joke, and he wrote horror, but then the Japanese political environment frowned on horror, and he had to change completely and write children's books. And it hasn't happened in America, but Stanislaw Lem and different writers in repressive regimes have been forced to write differently.
Yeah, I think if I ever wrote something differently, I would like to think it would be because it interested me, and I would love to do something my kids could read, for example. That would fascinate me, but I never have. But it would be because young adult is where you can make a lot of money, which is.
Well, it is fascinating hearing the different criticisms and the different and the power they would have on most of us to hear what you have to stand up against to write what you want to write. So one of the things that's come up is different writers using copy editors to deal with the problem you just discussed of you've been working on it for a year, and you don't entirely trust a character that you created. Do you use a copy editor yourself?
Not really. Actually, again, I'll give the first 100 pages to Pam and at least get that kind of litmus test. The first person, and then the critique group, these guys here just, are invaluable in terms of, I've been slaving over these, rewrites. Recently, I'm like, oh, this could be so much better. But the hard thing is the overall arc of the character, and my girlfriend actually is the first one to read my book when it's done, and she's not a copy editor. She has editorial training, so she'll help clean it up. But really, it's the feedback for the whole product from my agent, and that's usually a terrible 2-month wait when I send it to her, and I have no idea, because I have had her come back and say, this is one of the best things I've read for my clients, to I can't possibly show this to anybody. And it's, you're just hoping, and now I'm at the point where I kind of know, I know there's this issue here, it'll be interesting to see her reaction to it. But it's usually that initial reaction, and she is looking at it commercially. That's her job. So, in fact, that's the reason she had the criticism of my one book. She's like, I liked it, but it was just way too depressing and way too dark. And she's like, maybe it'll sell in the UK, but not in the US. So I actually spent a year rewriting that book, and it still didn't sell. So, to answer your question, it's really her feedback that gives me that first overall impression of the finished work, from a critical commercial eye.
So you use critique groups, and then you have some private readers, people whose opinion you trust. But you must have confronted, because you're willing to invest in your own work, the concept of a copy editor.
Absolutely, yeah. I have several friends who are copy editors. I don't know why I've never done that. I don't know if the idea of it kind of bothers me, that I don't want the feedback at that. I want Pam's feedback because I trust her. And it's not cheap. It's probably a good $1,000 for a decent copy edit. But that might be something that I guess I'm afraid that they're going to come back and rail on it, and then I wouldn't know what to do. Do I rewrite a whole book because the copy editor didn't like it? I'd be willing to do that because my agent didn't like it, because I trust her and I know her, but I don't know about a copy editor. So that's a good question.
How do you evolve? Because the relationships you describe that have great trust have evolved over a decade.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you evolve new trust and new opinions now?
Well, I don't know. I don't know that, because right now the opinions I get now are now from readers who are actually posting reviews, and you have to figure out okay, fortunately most of them have been good, but you get some pretty harsh reviews, and how do I trust this person that they're saying this with real knowledge and real reflection of the marketplace. The other trust I have, honestly, is from rejections from larger publishing houses, because they will write a fairly lengthy letter to Pam saying this is why we're not taking this book, and you do start to think, okay, if we got 4 people who all said your main character was weak, and these people are editors of these large houses, that's something you should look at, and usually that'll be reflected in my critique group as well. But there's not too many people that I've reached out to build new trust with. I kind of feel like I have enough, but that's the other problem is there's only so many opinions you can take, because everyone gives you a different one, and that gets very, very hard to juggle, because you do feel like you're trying to please everybody, and you end up changing things, and who do I listen to, and it's tough.
Last question. So how do you, in your own work, independent of any of the forces you have to deal with, how do you define success? How do you know that the manuscript you're looking at in front of you is successful from your viewpoint? How do you define that? How do you stop working?
Yeah, I usually don't have problems stopping working on things. I don't, by the time I get to the end, I know it needs rewrites. But by the time I get to the end, I'm usually happy with it. I'm happy with the concept of what I've written. I've never finished something and said, this is terrible, but at least it's done. You know, I get input from my critique group on a lot of it, and then Pam's reaction, the changes I make after that, that's kind of where the end comes. Where it's been, in her mind, it's good enough to go out to shop, to the marketplace. And I might make some changes based on what some editors will say, but generally that's where, you know, I know that it's good enough. It's going out to market, at least. Whether it gets rejected or accepted, you know, I feel like I'm happy with it, and usually by that point, boy, I'm ready to move on to something else, because, like I said, it's a year and I'm mentally tired of it.
How close to perfection does it feel to you as a writer looking at it?
Never very close. I mean, at the time it always feels close, and then you go back and read it a year later, and you're like, oh boy, I could really redo a lot of this stuff. But I don't have a big problem with that. I don't toil over that because I want to get on to something new, because I understand that it's never going to be perfect, and you know, as long as there's enough in there that you really feel happy about, you know, I'm willing to accept that everything I write is going to be far from perfect.
Well, we have a couple of final questions that came in from people in the audience that are trying to get their first book completed and sold. And one of the questions was, how do they know when to stop working on something they've been working on for a long time? How do they recognize a stopping point?
I guess that's always been self-evident to me, you know, in terms of you just kind of know. I mean, that's a really tough question to answer. I think there's a real risk of toiling over something for too long, you know, and I think a lot of people do that, and sometimes it makes it better, but I think usually it just makes you too close to the project, and you're not getting the perspective that you need on it. You've got to, you know, you'll hear people say put it in a drawer for a year and then look at it. I don't have the time to be able to wait for that. But I definitely realize that, you know, the more you work on something, and the more you rewrite something in particular, you put it at risk. So I would just advise people to, you know, to trust their instincts with it. And then, you know, if it's your first book, you don't know. Yeah, I mean, I sent out my first book to 80 agents over the course of probably a year and a half, and I got one who accepted it. Unfortunately, she's a good name, and she's, like I mentioned before, she's been awesome. But, you know, and for me, that was validation. Okay, I wrote something that was good enough, at least for that step. You know, so you have to just trust to stop at some point and just show your work and get feedback.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you sitting in.
With Ed, I'm always prepared to do the unexpected, and Ed has certainly been missed tonight.
Yeah.
And however, the Yogg Sothoth Awards are not complete. We are going to have people who won hopefully come back in November for a group discussion. So this ends the interview segment, and we'll take a bathroom break, and then ask Carter to do a reading when we come back. After that, question and answer.